Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in this world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm your hostess, Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm the moderator for today's event, and I welcome you. We have a really interesting webinar, hopefully, on deck today, and I've got some great speakers as well. But before we get started with it, I do have a few housekeeping items I need to go over. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, just know you'll be receiving a link after the webinar that will take you to the event on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if you miss, or if you have a question for any of our panelists, please just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions. And we'll take probably about 15 minutes or so near the end of the presentation, and we'll go through those questions. Okay, let's go ahead and move along here. We have, next slide, there we go. Okay, our panelists for today. We have Ziv Avidan, who's Chief Product Officer at OpenLegacy, Dana Boudreau, Senior Director, DevOps Product Management at CA, and Mike Fulton, who's CTO, DevOps Enterprise Systems at IBM. Hi guys, how are you? Welcome. Great to see your faces.
Great to be here.
Thanks, Charlene.
Awesome. All right, great. Well, today's webinar is it's all about mainframe automation. That's what we're talking about, it's actually based on. Hold on, my slides don't want to work for me here. There we go. Okay, so it's based on an ebook that DevOps has just put out, and it's available for download on DevOps.com. Also, the ebook is being sent out as a link in that follow-up email that we send out to everybody who registered. So if you're registered for the webinar, you will be receiving a link that you can download this ebook. There we go. It's an interesting webinar, or sorry, an interesting ebook, and hopefully the webinar will be equally interesting. Okay, so mainframe automation, what we're talking about. So today's, as I said before, today's discussion is based a lot on this ebook, and you know, not a lot of people in DevOps kind of think mainframes when they think DevOps, but you know, mainframes are pretty awesome. But they're not agile. The tools and the processes that make the mainframe so reliable often are those that kind of cause problems when they bump up against the world of DevOps, and that's just kind of a fact of life. So the overarching topic that we're going to be talking about today is bringing mainframes to DevOps, but the focus of this discussion is going to be on the automation that actually could move the mainframes kind of more fully into DevOps. But at least make mainframes more responsive so that DevOps can be a major part of the mainframe environment, and do it in less time. Do a lot of the mainframe actions that today take a lot more time than DevOps processes do. So the ebook offers some pointers for what organizations need to consider when they're thinking about all phases of that software development lifecycle when it comes to mainframe automation. Development, test, deploy, and we'll also have a couple other things that are worth talking about. So moving along. So the ebook takes the reader into different phases of kind of automating the mainframe at, as I said, that different phases of the software development lifecycle. And of course, phase one is development. So as you see on the screen, there are 6 bullet points, and these are kind of the things to consider when we're talking about development on the mainframe and bringing automation to development on the mainframe. And guys, I really want to get your input on what we're talking about here when it comes to mainframes and development and DevOps. One of the things that the writer Don McVitie, who did a great job, by the way, he's talking about when it comes to development is the fact that code is code. I mean, it doesn't really matter what it's sitting on. The code code is going to share some commonalities, whether it's running on a mainframe or another type of system. So one of the first steps that organizations really need to think about is trying to move that source code into kind of a version control system or a source code repository. Most mainframe source code management tools don't support full build automation. So guys, do you have any kind of pointers or best practices for that, that thought when we're talking about the version control system? Maybe any anecdotes or anything like that you can share?
Sure. There's one thing I'd like to point out and clarify a bit is, you mentioned that the mainframe is not agile. I would say that the mainframe can be used in the same way that other platforms can. There's nothing inherently non-DevOpsy about the mainframe. I think what's more prevalent in the industry is that people have applications that have developed over the last 20, 30, 40 years, and as such, they're built in older school ways, and those need to be transformed. Some people have already done that, some people haven't. But there are many companies out there today that are successfully using all the aspects of DevOps on the mainframe. So there's nothing inherently on the mainframe that prevents you from following standard DevOps principles. Just wanted to.
Yeah, no, Mike. I think that's a great point. And actually, one of the things that we do talk about is the fact that a lot of the mainframe applications are at least 20 years old. Some of them are even as old as 50 years old, and they, they run in a, kind of that. It's a kind of I call it a constrained mode to make sure that it just doesn't break because it's fragile code because it's so old. So what can we do when we're thinking about those applications to really kind of bring those to that DevOps environment also? Is it retargeting those applications? I think that's a huge thing that people need to consider is, it's the hardware, but a lot of times it's got more to do with the applications that are running on them.
And I would absolutely agree with Mike. I mean, not only is the mainframe not inherently not agile, sometimes, if you have processes built in place, I would say that you would see on mainframe environments, you would see a level of automation that you would hope to see in some other DevOps environments. So automation is not necessarily new to the mainframe. The challenges, I think, or some of the challenges that you do have with mainframes regarding DevOps are about two concepts, mainly. One of them is the combination of dev and ops. On the mainframe, it's not that trivial, not in terms of mindsets and not in terms of the tools that you have to combine those two aspects. So basically, the idea that the developers are also in charge of kind of the operation side goes against the grain in some of the things that you would do on a mainframe, and that's a thing to consider if you want to go there. And if you do, then exactly how you want to do that, what level of control do you want to have for your operations teams, and what level of control do you want to give your developers? So that's one point. The other point, of course, is the fact that the mainframe itself, while agile or can be agile, uses both concepts and constructs and assets that are different than other environments. So one of the challenges that you would have is basically integrating the pipeline from the mainframe all the way to the open environments and your systems of engagements, because most processes today involve the mainframe, but they're not exclusive to the mainframe. So doing an integrated pipeline, that might be another challenge that you might encounter when going to DevOps in the mainframe.
Good point, Dave.
So something I wanted to bring up here, I completely agree with V and Mike about the agile, but another thing I wanted to highlight is when we talk about SCM on a mainframe, traditional mainframe guys think of SCM as a a combination of things that the non-mainframe guys would look at. So on non-mainframe, there's SCM, which is about version control, merging, parallel development, what have you. And the product, as your book talks about, is Git. That's the primary front end there.
Mm-hmm.
But on the non-mainframe, managing the binaries and managing the lifecycle, in other words, doing the build, managing the objects after they've been compiled, and then managing the lifecycle as I move the code from development to test to pre-prod to prod. Those are typically different products off mainframe, but on the mainframe, traditional mainframe, SCM, the term SCM encompasses all of those steps. And it's important for, I think, that point to be understood by at least non-mainframe oriented people as they read the book.
That's a good point. Okay. Great, great. So what are some of the other things that, that folks need to be cognizant of when we're talking about development and automation on the mainframe? I mean, we mentioned the age of applications. What about the number of users who are using applications that were developed 20, 30 years ago? I mean, that obviously has changed as well. But what are some of the other things that folks need to kind of keep in mind?
Well, I really like the point that Zeev mentioned earlier, that the huge challenge that we've got to move from the dev and the ops pillar to a DevOps environment on the mainframe. And, I agree with his points about the fact that today the tools, the processes, everything is structured around these two separate pillars. Whereas on other platforms, this notion of self-service for the developers is very prevalent. I think that's something that we as a community have started pushing on and need to continue pushing on, how we can change the role of the operations team to be service providers to their developers, so that developers can have more of a self-service model. I think that would be huge, and it ties directly into your automation point, which is how can operations folks codify their wisdom into services that can then be securely delivered to the developers that need to use them. So I'm curious what others think of that.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think maybe to continue on that point, I mean, there's a kind of a level of you need to make the decision of how much you're ready kind of to give control to your developers, because on a mainframe you would have considerations that are even more important than other environments. So for example, scalability, which is an extremely important concept in terms of the DevOps cycle, the way you deploy and how you scale. These things are affected by your DevOps pipeline and are treated a little differently on a mainframe side, especially today where the needs are more. You would have a lot of workloads that are not necessarily directly connected to the business, and because a lot of different system of engagements, and you would want to provide a high level of service to the end customer, and all of those things do not necessarily translate directly into business transactions. They're not making money to the organization, for example. So you need to be careful in terms of exactly how you scale and how you treat those workloads, but you do want to give your developers kind of a level of control on what they're deploying, and on the pace of that deployment. You want to increase velocity. It is the overall, I mean, that's why you're moving towards DevOps. So it's an interesting kind of trade-off here between how to, for a lack of a better word, how much you trust your developers to be able to make those decisions, and how much you automate those things, so you kind of avoid having those kinds of issues around workloads.
So when we're talking about developing on the mainframe, are we talking about not having a separate set of mainframe developers, or do you think we'll always have mainframe developers versus other systems developers or other application developers? I mean, or do you think we're always going to have different populations of developers that way?
I think everybody's gonna. Go ahead, Dave.
Go ahead. Hey, no. Go ahead, Mike. I think it was Mike speaking.
Yeah. I'll let you go in first, sir. Dana, take you.
Yeah, no, that's cool. I always challenge Charlene to predict the future, but I believe that the balance of working on different platforms is going to become the burden or the challenge of the common. People will have to work on multiple platforms, so they have to be working in multiple languages, whether that's Java or PHP or COBOL, and being able to run JCL and things like that, I think will be the responsibility of the new talent coming on board. I think it'll take time. Some organizations will go there quickly. Other organizations may go there, more slowly, and there may be still some silos. And I can imagine there may be experts even after we've tried to, make developers work on all platforms. But I mean, clearly, we're trying to work on making the technology accessible, making it look and feel similar across platforms, and making the mainframe an equal player in openness and bringing new talent on board.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the look and feel similar, I think, is a key point, because I agree with Dana. You're always going to have your experts in particular domains, but more and more people will be asked to have a broader role, right? So you see the full stack developer has emerged over the last few years as a desired role as people are moving across JavaScript, Node.js type environments. I think you'll see that continue. I think it's important that the mainframe embrace that and that we do everything in our power to make it as easy as possible for people to be able to exploit the mainframe, take advantage of all the capabilities of the box. So one thing that we've introduced fairly recently, we being the larger ZOS community, is Zoe. I'm not sure how many people have heard of that yet, but it's an open source initiative, and the intent is exactly as Dana points out, and it started out with Rocket CA and IBM, but now it's something that everybody can and hopefully will contribute to. And the whole point of it, in my mind, is providing a modern environment to access the mainframe, whether it's APIs, command line interface, or a UI access to the mainframe. And this is all about eliminating unnecessary inhibitors to being able to access the mainframe, to making it easier to use.
Yeah, I think you mentioned, Mike, earlier when you were talking about keeping the mainframe open and allowing developers to be able to, self-service, I think is the word you used, and I agree with. And this Zoe project really reinforces those words you were talking about.
And perhaps I would maybe add to that, because I absolutely agree both with Dana and Mike. But I would say that, I mean, if we're connecting it kind of to the larger, broader trend, of course, I mean, you will always have to maintain your applications on the mainframe, and some of them will not be in, the most modern technologies necessarily, which is the case in other platforms as well. But if you're looking at the broader trend, which is microservices and APIs, it doesn't really matter, because the idea of, for example, polyglot microservices means that it doesn't really matter what is the underlying technology, as long as you keep your contracts. So if the contract is a RESTful API, for example, it doesn't really matter what runs behind that. So a mainframe can be absolutely a first-class citizen in the microservices architecture, as long as it keeps that kind of interface. So I believe that there will always be some differences dealing with the mainframe. I mean, it's a different beast than others, but that will have less and less significance going forward in terms of how do I integrate that mainframe into everything else that I'm doing?
Okay, so I'm thinking about the idea of bringing. It almost sounds like, because we're working more in an open source environment, and we're using all these different languages. It's almost, in my mind, it's almost like a homogenization, if you will. It's making the mainframe more accessible. It's not kind of separating it and making it like this special case, and I'm using air quotes here. When I say that, it almost sounds like we're trying to get the mainframe to the point where anybody can work on it, realizing that there will always be, as you just said, Z, certain applications that may not be kind of DevOps friendly, if you will, but just kind of in automation plays a large role in being able to make it more accessible to work on a mainframe, for anybody to work on a mainframe, basically. I got it right or not?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
No,
yeah. I mean,
right.
if you don't do the automation, then you're never going to achieve the continuous integration and the agile aspects and being able to move quickly and all that. So clearly, it's a fundamental part. I mean, I think another part that sometimes is overlooked with automation is the benefit you get from really eliminating the magic, right? So today, if you're a developer on the mainframe, you ask an operations guy to set something up for you, magic happens, and now you've got your environment. Well, if you automate things and people can look at the automation and understand it, the magic's gone. And now all of a sudden, it gives people a chance to learn and expand what they're doing in all these different dimensions, which I think is really important. It makes the system much more stable, much easier to build all of your testing and everything else around it, and just a lot more fun to work with. You don't hit these hard barriers where you go, well, I can't go any farther because this is where the magic starts, right? Magic's all gone.
Yeah, I agree. I think also there's an element of repeatability that brings quality into the system. If I do the steps in an automated way, they're always done the same way. So as you find problems, you're actually improving the quality, incrementing the quality you're adding to the process, rather than having to go back and fix things that were potentially done in the wrong way in a manual way.
All right.
And I would add, I completely agree, but I would add to that, in terms of automation on a mainframe, why it's specifically important is because on a mainframe, unfortunately, you don't have as many skilled people as you would like out there in the market, and automation is a kind of force multiplier. So if you have a rather small team and you would like to have a bigger team of people who know everything there is to know about your processes on the mainframe, but you don't have those people, automation can be kind of the way to multiply their force and be able to do a lot of things with them just dealing with the automation and not dealing with the day-to-day of it. So I think that is specifically important for the mainframe environments with regard to automating those processes.
Okay.
Definitely. That's the whole codify your wisdom thing. The 165-year-old operations guy that's responsible for 300 developers. That's a scary high-risk aspect of a lot of companies, right? And so automating is a great way to help that.
Help make that transition easier when he finally does retire and that knowledge base isn't there anymore. Yeah, I agree. It sounds like we're kind of moving to an environment where it's better to know a lot about or better to know a little about a lot of things than to know a lot about a little thing. So all right, so we need to kind of push forward here. So the second thing is test. Talking about automation with in DevOps and the mainframe, and you guys will see with each one that the first one is always integration with corporate systems, other corporate systems. So obviously that's kind of huge, because you want to bring the mainframe, further into the other corporate systems. Whether we're talking about making it part of the continuous delivery or the testing environment, whatever. You need to make sure that the mainframe doesn't again kind of sit off to the side and run its own thing and always be forever a quote unquote special case. So, but you know, I guess one thing we do want to point out is automated testing actually isn't new to mainframes, and obviously it's not new to DevOps either. But there rarely are the systems that the two groups use integrated. So, guys, do you think that kind of bringing the maybe one umbrella, testing umbrella for mainframes and DevOps, you know, can the two ever actually kind of come meet in the middle and possibly use the same testing? Or do you think that's, you know, the idea of testing is always going to be you know, separate tools for both processes? And does that even work anymore to further automation?
There's just nothing inherent. Again, there's nothing inherently special about the mainframe when it comes to testing. As soon as you're dealing with large enterprise systems, whether it's on a Linux box or a mainframe or wherever, you have the inherent problems of you know, how you go from unit test to component test to integration test, et cetera. I think one of the key things is I see a lot of shops that try and get away with, you know, one or two test approaches, right? So they might have a minimal amount of function testing and then some integration and system testing. And I really think that actually having more testing at different levels can really help. So if you beef up your unit testing, you beef up the notion of what component testing is all about, and you really understand how you're doing your testing, that can relieve you of a lot of the burden on the integration testing side, which still has to be done, still must be done, but hopefully you can drastically reduce the number of failures you're seeing out at that integration level. So I think that's the shift that needs to happen in the mainframe.
I can completely agree that testing on mainframe is very similar to testing off mainframe, in the sense of your testing interfaces, whether those be user interfaces, whether they be programming interfaces, or whether they be runtime kind of interfaces. At the end of the day, they're common, and more over time, the architectures are more common. I do think there is a challenge of test data that's scaled on a mainframe. You know, what's a large database off mainframe can be a relatively medium-sized database when you look at it from a mainframe point of view, and that is a real challenge for creating test data and having test data that's optimal to reduce test time, but yet keep sure that you've got the complete coverage.
I would absolutely agree, and I would add to that one of the key aspects of it in terms of the automation is the importance of APIs and separate APIs for that matter. Because if you're really thinking about kind of a test-driven design and you're thinking about the entirety of the process, not just the you know, the COBOL program on the mainframe or the Java program on the mainframe, but the entirety of the process, being able to test every step of the way individually becomes paramount. And if you're doing it right, that means that there will be no places in that process where you have zero visibility, which is a problem right now, because you would have zero visibility both on the mainframe and in the integration stack above the mainframe, and that is a problem that a lot of organizations are wrestling with right now. If you are really kind of investing in API-driven, test-driven design, and really on all of those levels of testing, then you will have visibility to all of those levels, and that means that the automation process will be easier. And again, that all goes to velocity and your ability to deploy faster.
So do you guys ever see a time when, here we go with the crystal ball again, when the two environments will be able to use the same testing applications or testing systems, and it will be this kind of seamless process? Doesn't matter what, you know, whether it's mainframe or not.
I think it depends the level of. Oh, go ahead, Dana.
No, go ahead. I can support you. You can support me. We're probably going to agree on this conversation, so I'll let you go first this time.
That's a good thing, I think.
We're being incredibly agreeable. I mean, I think the I mean, I think one of the areas where we could make a lot of headway would be in understanding the test cases, right? I think people have loads of test cases. They automate them. I think, IBM has something called Z-Unit, which is built on standard unit testing. Other companies have similar frameworks. So I think that the fundamentals of how you do unit testing and component testing are completely consistent and can be consistent across the boxes. I think one of the things that is perhaps mundane and boring, but that is very valuable, is getting in and actually understanding how you're testing, understanding the quality of your testing, using various test analysis tools. We have something called code coverage, but other tools to just be able to look at what your tests do, make sure that they're high quality, beef them up when they're not, and they probably aren't. Throw away a bunch of tests that you don't actually need anymore. Like, how often do people cull tests and reduce the tests that are actually unnecessary and just slowing down their automation processes? And of course, automating. But so I think that whole hygiene area, which is, like I said, kind of boring and not very exciting, I guess, from a technology perspective, but it's so critical to really making inroads on testing.
I would say there's another element here worth mentioning, and that is, I think we talk in the book about how software projects have a lot of different components, and sometimes those components aren't all developed at the same speed. And so the need to be able to simulate interfaces, APIs, or simulate environments, like maybe I simulate the mainframe as I'm testing a non-mainframe application, that can be provided in tools and technology as well, and it can be an important part of the automation, test automation process. In CA we have a product called Service Virtualization, which actually simulates APIs as well as the Kix environment. I think IBM has something as well.
All right.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's a fundamental concept of DevOps. So it's not a mainframe thing, that loosely coupled components. The fact that you can develop components that you can test independently from one another, and then of course integrate them together later, is a pretty fundamental concept. And I agree once again with Dana. Ours is RTI, and it's a great tool for that.
Okay. Is that technology something that's relatively new? I mean, and if not, why are we kind of still having this conversation about testing and DevOps in the mainframe and automation? It kind of seems like if that is not a new technology, then it should be kind of a given that the solution has already kind of come to light.
It's a shift. It's a non-trivial shift to go from traditional monolith development, where you have this big app that you're working with, it's millions of lines of code, to the notion of these componentized environments. And Dana hit on a really key thing earlier, which is how to scale this to large databases in production is a non-trivial problem. So, But yeah, I think you're right. The notion of stubbing out calls to a service or to a function, I learned that in university a long time ago. So it's not new stuff.
I think that Mike touched on it, and I'll summarize it as saying the complexity and the risk that changes can have on the mainframe are. The scope is tremendously different than a particular web server that serves one particular set of use cases. I'm thinking about the Social Security Administration and what happens if a mistake's made and people aren't getting their Social Security check. I think that's pretty catastrophic in the United States.
Yeah. Okay. Makes sense. Okay, Ziv,
and that's nothing against the Social Security Administration. That's just an example of what could happen.
He says, thinking that, oh God, I'm not going to get a check one of these days. I'm on a
Well,
list
no,
now.
yeah, yeah,
Oh, all right. So before we move on, Steve, do you have any final thoughts on testing and automation and DevOps and mainframes and the big party?
No, so I
Okay.
would again have to agree
Yeah.
with what was said before. I would just mention that if we were start working with a mainframe from scratch today, we can
Hmm.
just use whatever the modern technologies are. The mainframe would support all of that.
Hmm.
So it's not really an issue of can you do it on a mainframe. It's more of an
Hmm.
issue of can you do it with the application that you already have, your legacy application. That is
Yeah.
really kind of the problem, because the mainframe as a platform is an extremely modern platform
Hmm.
today, extremely robust and very capable. So it's more of an how do I adapt with what I have, modern ways and processes of doing things.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Okay, we're going to move ahead to deploy. So again, it's it's almost like I almost want to call it like a chicken and egg problem, right? It's is it easier to just deploy on a mainframe, or is it more difficult to bring the DevOps processes in and deploy on try to deploy that way? But it's kind of a tough conversation, I think. But I think when you look at all the different factors, the age of the applications, the number of users of applications now, their impact on other applications, it's almost like a spaghetti bowl of issues. But I'd really like to hear what you guys have to say about this deploy process on the mainframe, and really how automation can be um, you know, hopefully it can help out.
yeah. I mean, I think deployment on the mainframe it's not a new problem. It's been around for a long time. I think the scope has changed from being just on the mainframe to being across multiple platforms. So as the first bullet says, integration with other corporate systems, and we're seeing that being driven through Jenkins. I would also say that deploy is not just about the application and the source code, but being able to deploy the particular runtimes and the configuration for those runtimes, the automated test scripts, potentially the service, the virtualized services, and the data. Being able to deploy the data, being able to deploy the right data into the right databases. And on the mainframe, yes, there's DB2, relational databases, but there's other database structures like IMS, VSAM, etc., which don't follow the same kind of relational constructs that also have to be deployed potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a great point. I mean, deploying on the mainframe is kind of a misnomer, because you're not just deploying a mainframe today. I mean, the mainframe is a system of record, but usually just a part of a larger process. And that process goes from your mainframe through an integration stack, some middlewares, and then to the kind of eventually to a system of engagement. And that means that you need to bundle together some mainframe and some non-mainframe elements. And if your middleware stack, for example, does not support it or is opaque, then really, I mean, you can do your best in terms of how do I deploy on a mainframe, but the entirety of the process will not deploy automatically. So, I mean, there are any numbers of ways to address that. I mean, with OpenLegacy, we chose a kind of a code-first approach, where basically your entirety of the integration stack is based on code, so it's easy to integrate into DevOps pipeline. Of course, there are other ways to do that, but it is extremely important to remember that the mainframe today is not an island. It is very much connected, and it is very important to be able to bundle and deploy everything, and of course test and all of those other things, everything together, and not think of those as different silos or different, not think of it as platforms, but think of these as business processes across your organization.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's a key thing, is that the notion of whether it's a mainframe component or a Linux component or a front end component really is not so important. The key thing is how can you deploy a version of a service or a component or whatever you want to call it in a controlled way, such that you can make sure you're not going to bust something. And if you do bust something, how can you, in a controlled way, roll it back and be comfortable that you can do that? So again, automation is pretty critical here. You don't want to have somebody tapping in on a operator console to do this deploy. You want it to be an automated process. So I think one of the key things is recognizing that, you know, in complex systems, you typically are going to have multiple versions of a particular service active at a given time as you're staging a rollout of it, and being able to deal with that in a well thought out way is pretty critical. And, you know, mainframe people have been doing it for years. I think the key shift is now just a fully automated version of that, as opposed to, you know, operators clacking away doing the deploy.
Okay. All right, great. So we've gotten quite a few questions in already, which is great. And I do encourage the audience to send in your questions if you do have one or many for our panelists here. But a number of the questions have kind of been around this concept of lifting and shifting. And so I'd kind of like to delve into that a little bit when we're talking about moving into different environments, when we're talking about lifting and shifting applications, things of that nature. And you know, I'd like to kind of get your thoughts on some of the things that really have to be considered when we're talking about lifting and shifting on the mainframe or from the mainframe. So, you know, Mike, what are some of the things that kind of come to mind for you when you think about the concept of lifting and shifting in the mainframe?
Well, needless to say, since I'm a mainframe guy, I'm always keen to not lift and shift. But I think even if you do want to do that, regardless, the first step needs to be a deep understanding of how your application works, which sounds pretty obvious. But if you have a 40-year-old application that's comprised of millions of lines of COBOL and assembler code, the odds that any one person has a good handle on how that application works is zero. So, you know, we have a particular tool, application discovery, that lets you get that deep understanding of how the application works, understand how all the pieces fit together. And, you know, I think if you're doing any sort of significant refactoring of code, whether it's a lift and shift or it's service enablement, API enablement, that type of thing, you want to do that type of deep understanding of your application, understand the interfaces, understand the database connections, that type of thing. And similarly, just as important is test understanding, which is often overlooked. But, you know, the notion of, you know, how do my test cases work? What are they actually testing? It can be a great way to understand your application. Once you've got that understanding, then you'll also have a better appreciation for the value of what you've got. And then you may decide to not shift it at all to another platform, or you might decide to do some sort of hybrid approach where you take particular components off the platform. But until you've done that understanding of your application, it would be, I think, a little too bold to just go and rip it off the box and slap it somewhere else, because you don't probably know how it works.
Okay.
And I would absolutely agree, and I would add to that. I mean, there are basically three approaches that people are considering right now, and one of them is lift and shift. Of course, the challenges of lift and shift, and we saw that over the last decade, these are pretty complex projects, and they're prone to failure. I mean, there are some successful examples of those, but there are, you know, very painful failures in those kinds of projects. And they are complex, and they're complex for a reason. I mean, these are a lot of that's a lot of code across all time. So lift and shift is one of this kind of rehosting, replatforming, which is doesn't give you much in terms of your ability to do more with what you have, but does, you know, deal with some you know, cost structure or pricing structures in terms of what the hardware you're using. Again, you can debate whether that's beneficial or not. But then on the other hand, you have the API enablement. I would say that even if you're moving towards eventually migrating away from your mainframe, which is again not necessarily the best thing to do, but in some cases it is, doing it in one fell swoop, that's not necessarily the best way to go. And another way of thinking about this is, first of all, trying to kind of decouple and separate those business processes on your mainframe into microservices, or that's the most common and building those microservices with APIs to separate those business processes, and then do what we call a phased migration. And a phased migration is basically deciding, okay, so this specific business process is a priority for me to migrate, and I will migrate just that process. What that prevents is basically this kind of concept of having a 3-4 years project where you do nothing else, and you don't get any new features, any new benefits, and you just focus on this lift and shift, which might fail. And instead of that, you're getting value from day one, and in the background, you can decide what's best to migrate. And in some cases, you would say, well, I only want to migrate 20% of my processes, and everything else should stay on the mainframe. So taking a much more, I would say, granular approach to what you're trying to do, I would say would in most cases would give you better results than just trying to kind of move everything away. And in doing so, things like automating the creation of your APIs, and really being able to send those existing APIs to more business logic that might be kind of a hybrid from what you have on your mainframe to what you have outside of your mainframe. These are coexistence methods that can really help you with that process of getting value day one, but also, having a path forward into migrating on later stage.
All right. Interesting. Dana, do you have any thoughts on the whole lift and shift concept with respect to mainframes and automation?
I would do +1 on both what Mike and Z said. I was thinking about the customers that I talk to. The first step is understanding what they have. Mm-hmm. The second step is, can I structure this code so that there are interfaces that if I break some pieces off to shift them to another platform, I could do it in a structured way that could be easily managed from a risk point of view as well as tested, and that brings in the discussion that we're having about creating APIs and what have you. So I would say +1 to what was said already.
Okay. All right, great. So I'm going to go ahead and push forward then into the other category, which includes API generation, and also, kind of understanding the overall software architecture and how each application and the systems kind of interact with each other. And you guys have both, all three of you have actually kind of mentioned the importance of, understanding how everything works together, and that's kind of a critical thing, because obviously they all have an impact on the way the others work. So, and then one of the things that was also brought up in the ebook is the possibility of maybe running a Linux partition on a mainframe to kind of, create maybe an integration point for bringing the mainframe subsystems and data kind of more into the corporate DevOps processes, so you're not kind of, you've got this special little environment to be able to kind of work around in for a while. I mean, what do you guys think about that concept? Is that something that maybe is being done, but it's not really wide scale? It's something that could be expanded on, or what are your thoughts on the idea of using Linux?
I think it's a great opportunity as a side effect of this application discovery and this componentization, right? Mm-hmm. So it might be that what you find is you would really like to leverage the capabilities of a Linux box in terms of perhaps the tools or perhaps some of the software and middleware that's available there. But you recognize that you can't, you have significant requirements, SLAs, for your responsiveness on some of these requests. And so enabling these components and moving them from ZOS to Linux on Z can be an excellent solution to your problem. So I view it as a step two after you've done this refactoring to have these loosely coupled components that you've got that capability to do the move. But at that point, you know, it can make a lot of sense. But you know, it's all about the business side of it. What are your SLAs? What are your requirements? Can you target can you afford the increased latency that even moving it to Linux on Z is going to incur? That type of analysis.
Completely agree, Mike. Something else I wanted to add, Charlene, to this chart is when I think about automation, and we've had a discussion about automating development, about automating tests, automating deployment, some discussion here about source, but to me there's other components of the software development cycle that need to be integrated and automated. Things like change management, things like this source code analysis typically has a database that needs to stay current with changes. Potentially problems found in production on one change system have to be synchronized as changes are being made on the development side. And that cross-lifecycle integration, automation, it's better that it's automated so that it's not left as a step for the developer or a tester or maybe a system programmer to make sure that all those things are put together. So cross-lifecycle integration, I think, is another thing.
Those are great points, yeah.
I completely agree with both points. I mean, in terms of the automation, I mean, at OpenLegacy, our core mission is to automate the process of creating those APIs for legacy applications. But more, I mean, once you do that, it is important to have a flexible running environment, runtime environment. And if you necessarily need to do a kind of more of an appliance kind of thing or specific runtime environment that are not that flexible, you might not be able to, for example, run them on a Linux on your mainframe. But if you have a very flexible way to deploy those integration points, then doing so on the Linux environment of the mainframe can bring you a lot of efficiency, specifically around the communication between the integration part and the actual application, because you're not using actual communication, you're using hypersockets and all of these kind of goodies that IBM provide. So that can really not only bring you a very automated, streamlined way of creating those APIs, but also a very performant way of accessing them, which is, of course, increasingly important if you are thinking of becoming digital. Becoming digital is not just about having all of those APIs, is having consumable and usable APIs on a grand scale.
Good point.
So another area of automation that I think is worth poking at is the automation of provisioning and deprovisioning systems for people to use. So one of the huge struggle points that I think a modern developer has on the mainframe is that they have to typically work side by side another 1,000 developers, and it's like a bunch of people living in one big house, and all the annoyances that go along with that. Rent is great, but there's some downsides. So so one of the things that we've been working on for a while now is the notion of being able to provide development environments for small teams, full application, ZOS application environments for small teams, 10 to 20 people type of idea. And I think moving to that type of model where people can work in both these small team environments, and whether that's running on ZVM or LPARs or the ZB&T technology that we have, which is an emulation environment, I'm not. That's more of a money thing, but I think that notion of being able to provide those type of environments to developers is huge. There's lots of complexities. Security is one. Another big one is the test data that Dana's mentioned a few times. Huge issues with how to create those environments. But when you can unleash it and make it work, it's amazing. And we have a variety of customers that are doing that today. They have these environments set up where they can have these small component teams be able to work on their isolated ZOS box. And it's a game changer. It's a culture shift. It's a massive culture shift, really enabling this whole continuous integration thing. And I'll put in a quick plug. We have a free ZOS as a service thing going on right now that I'd be happy to tell people about, where we've got one of these environments that you can spin up in the IBM cloud and play with for free today. And I think it is something that will revolutionize the way we do development on the mainframe.
All right, so we have about 5 minutes to the top of the hour, so I do want to give you guys a minute or so each to just talk about your company a little bit, so everybody has an idea of where you are when it comes to mainframes and the landscape. So Zeev, I'm going to go ahead and let you, I'm sorry, this looks like it's Dana's. So Dana, why don't you go ahead and talk about yours first? Sorry about that.
Yeah, I was fascinated to see Zeev do my chart. That's cool. Anyway,
I appreciate that.
I could be mean and take the whole 5 minutes here, but 1 minute here. Summary, where I see things, customers want the platform to be open. They want it easily accessible so they can integrate the mainframe into their overall cross-platform solutions. Things that we have done recently in this regard are Brightside, which is providing command line interfaces into the mainframe to do all kinds of mainframe activities, and that's part of the Zoe project what Mike talked about earlier, which is an open source project, the first mainframe open source project, and so that was all in this theme of making the platform, just like any other platform from a development point of view. Another big area is bringing support and making it easy to bring new skills onto the platform. We talked about it earlier, where there's new talent coming into software development. There's existing talent that's off mainframe, and they need to be able to build the skills in the mainframe and do software development like they do it off mainframe. And then using automation and intelligence to optimize the resources and use the minimum set of skills that you do have. And I'll stop there for time.
All right, thanks, Dana. Okay, moving along. Let's see, Zowie. So is that how it's pronounced? Is it Zowie?
Zoe.
Zowie. Yes, he's Zowie. Oh well, I guess I'm more comic book than.
I'm gonna say it sounds very comic. Exactly.
Yeah.
So,
Zoe. Yes. It didn't have the W in it until the end, but now it's got the W in it, which is a we, so it's all good.
Zowie. Oh, okay. All right. I get it. All right. Great. Okay.
Is this my slide?
Yeah.
On mine.
Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
It could have been anybody's, because it is open source, and you see IBM and CA and Rocket are the three founding members. But it's key. The key thing is it's founding members. It's open for people to contribute to. I did mention it earlier. I think the key takeaway that you want to get from this is that there's three fundamental ways to access the mainframe: APIs, CLIs, and a web UI. And in each of those cases, it's open source. In each of those cases, it's designed to be extensible. So if you have your own APIs that you want to connect in, you want to put in your own debug API, you want to put in your own source code management API, you would build that on top of this foundation. Similarly with the command line interface, same idea. And web UI, definitely. The idea is if you have the greatest VSAM editor in the world for a UI and you want to plug it in there, go for it. That the intent is that you can integrate it right in. The idea is this could be something you could sell, or it might be something that you contribute to open source along with the base Zoe. So that's Zoe in a nutshell.
All right, great. So I want to give, let's see, that's the end-to-end DevOps. OpenLegacy.
That looks like an IBM. Okay. Yeah, I guess okay.
Zeev?
Okay, so OpenLegacy, it's a platform for automatically generating microservices-based APIs from legacy applications. So you move from the legacy applications to a microservices architecture basically automatically, and we've worked with some large banks and others, and basically you can do that in days instead of months. And that is what the platform does. It's a new way, it's a new approach for integration. I would say it's a middleware middleware less integration, but basically it's you leapfrog over your 20, 30 years of legacy technology into the most modern microservices architecture without changing anything on your backend application. So still your legacy application run as is, but you get all the benefits of microservices. That's basically what we do, and we do it in different way than you would normally find out there in the market. So it's a code-first approach, and it is very much compatible with DevOps processes. So everything fits into your DevOps pipeline, and very easy to maintain, and of course easy to deploy anywhere you want, any JVM, any cloud environment, on-prem, and so on and so forth.
All right. Wow, great. That's awesome. And I always run out of time with these webinars, which I guess is a good thing. But I do want to thank Dana and Ziv and Mike for being my guests today on this Mainframe webinar. Thanks, guys, for your time. Really appreciate it. Lots of great information. So thanks for joining me. Also want to remind the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, you will be receiving an email with a link to the webinar on demand. The webinar is also going to be living on the DevOps.com website, so if you can always access it there. Just go to the webinars tab, look under on demand, and it should be right there. Also, everybody who registered for today's webinar will be receiving a link in that email to the ebook that we discussed during the webinar, so you can download it and share it with your friends and loved ones. So, but again, thank you all for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.